In the dead of winter, 1851, the halls of St. Catherine's Academy for Young Ladies were draped in silence. Snow pressed heavily against the windows, muffling even the slightest sound, until Elizabeth Hartwell, a literature teacher and curious, soul by nature, decided to explore the oldest part of school's basement. She wasn't searching for horror-only extra materials for her next lesson, but what she discovered instead would disturb her peace forever. Behind a crumbling stone wall in an unused supply room, she noticed something strange and uneven seam. In the brickwork, as if part of the wall had been hastily rebuilt. Driven by instinct, Elizabeth pried it loose. What greeted her was a room untouched by time and choked with grief. 24 tiny iron-framed beds, each shackled at the headboard. At the foot of each bed lay a solitary Idema doll with missing eyes, a ribbon dulled with age, a small crucifix etched with bite marks. But what froze Elizabeth in place were the words scratched into the wall with frantic, childlike strokes. "We are still here." It was not a question. It was a scream from beyond, carved into silence. Terrified, Elizabeth reported her discovery to the local authorities. But the wheels of Massachusetts bureaucracy turned slowly, and sometimes not at all. Her testimony, raw and urgent, vanished into state archives, sealed inside a mason jar, and buried behind the Academy's altar, never to be seen again, not until 1987. It took a renovation crew, tearing up floorboards and gutting the foundation, to rediscover Elizabeth's words and the horrors they hinted at. What followed was a cascade of evidence and eyewitness accounts that unearthed one of New England's darkest, most fiercely protected secrets. But to truly grasp what happened to those 24 vanished girls, we need to return further to a time when Massachusetts was changing, but its shadows were growing longer. In 1834, Salem, Massachusetts, still bore the weight of its witch trial legacy like a scar. Though nearly 150 years had passed, the town remained steeped in fear, superstition, and stern religiosity. Its skyline, pierced by the steeples of Congregationalist churches, looked more like accusing fingers pointed at heaven than sanctuaries of grace. Amidst this backdrop of spiritual rigidity and industrial boom, St. Catherine's Academy was born, built atop Gallows Hill Road. Ironically, the very land where witches had once been condemned. The Academy began its life in what was once the estate of a wealthy merchant. Its tall, narrow windows and sharp Gothic gables gave it a facade of somber nobility. But the stone was cold, and the halls darker than they ought to have been. The school marketed itself as a charitable haven for orphaned girls, ages 12 to 17. Glossy leaflets promised moral development, a refined education, and domestic training that would prepare these young ladies for service in respectable Christian homes. Families, broken by cholera, fire, or factory accidents, entrusted their daughters to St. Catherine's, believing they would be safe, fed, and loved. But things are rarely as they appear. At the helm stood Mother Superior Victoria Whitman, a woman of unnerving poise and unyielding command. Towering and severe, she moved through Salem with the air of divine appointment. With her accent polished to Beacon Hill perfection, she spoke of God's mercy and duty with conviction. Her credentials claimed she had been educated at Mount Holyoke and had worked in Irish orphanages, a saint in black robes. Alongside her were Sister Margaret Collins and Sister Agnes Murphy. Margaret, soft-spoken with a gentle Irish lilt, taught literature and music, often becoming a maternal figure for the grieving girls. Agnes, on the other hand, was the disciplinarian. Her eyes cold, her rosary ever present, she oversaw finances, adoptions, and order with military precision. To Salem's residents, the Academy was a blessing, a solution to a growing social crisis. Even the Protestant ministers, though ideologically opposed to Catholicism, praised the women for taking in the forgotten daughters of New England. But the Academy's kindness was a carefully constructed illusion. Girls entered through the front gate, welcomed with warm meals and promises of new beginnings. 12-year-old Catherine Murphy, whose father died in a railway collapse, arrived teary-eyed but hopeful. Sarah Thompson came after tuberculosis swept through her tenement. 13-year-old Mary O'Brien walked through the gate after her family perished in a textile factory blaze. They were promised safety. They received shackles. The Academy operated like a tight ship on paper. Mornings began with prayer, followed by arithmetic and embroidery. The girls learned how to cook, sew, and behave like future governesses or pious wives. They wore identical gray dresses and white aprons. Their hair was tied back, and their voices kept low. To outsiders, the place seemed a model of order and sanctity. Visitors saw tidy dormitories, polite girls at desks, and 3 women cloaked in sacrifice and charity. No one asked to see the 3rd floor. No one was invited to the basement. No one. Noticed that, although new girls frequently arrived, none seemed to graduate or leave. Worse still, no girl ever wrote back. The promise of placement with Christian families came with a peculiar condition: total silence. No letters, no return visits, no trace. For nearly a decade, this silence remained unbroken, until a young woman named Emma Prescott happened to be walking past a brothel in Boston's North End. It was a bitter February morning in 1843. Emma, now a seamstress, was on her way to work when she heard a soft, haunting tune echoing from an upper window, a lullaby she hadn't heard in years. It was a tune only one person used to sing, Mary O'Brien, her childhood friend. Emma stopped. The voice was unmistakable. Through a narrow gap in the curtain, she glimpsed a girl in an elegant silk dress, far too grown-up, far too revealing. Her face was older, haunted, yet familiar. Mary. The girl's eyes, once warm and vibrant, now looked hollow. Distant. Emma wanted to call out, but when she approached the door, a towering man stepped out and made it clear she was unwelcome. That night, Emma wrote a letter to St. Catherine's, asking after Mary. What she received in return was a dismissal cloaked in courtesy. Sister Agnes replied with a polite but chilling explanation. Mary had been placed with a devout family in western Massachusetts. They had requested privacy. Mary was fine, but wanted no further contact. But Emma noticed something odd, 2 styles of handwriting in one letter. The body was written in Sister Anne's meticulous hand. The signature? Sloppy, rushed, a forgery. This suspicion might have ended there. But fate wasn't finished with Emma Prescott. Not yet. Spring had barely touched Boston's cobblestones in 1843 when Emma Prescott's world began to unravel. Week after receiving that peculiar letter from Sister Agnes, the one laced with hollow reassurances and inconsistent handwriting, Emma tried to convince herself that perhaps she was mistaken. Maybe the girl in the window hadn't been Mary O'Brien. Maybe the lullaby had simply stirred a memory, not reality, but doubt clung to her like wet wool. 3 months later, on an ordinary afternoon in Faneuil Hall, Emma saw something that shattered any illusion of coincidence. Among the bustling market crowd, her eyes locked onto a girl no older than 14. Freckles danced across the child's nose, her hair the color of early autumn wheat. And her face, Emma knew it. Sarah Thompson. She remembered Sarah from the Academy, a quiet girl with a gentle spirit. Emma had often seen her in the library, nose buried in books she barely understood, yet determined to read. But this Sarah was changed. The girl walked mechanically beside a man twice her age, well-dressed, polished, a gentleman in appearance. Only, the way his fingers gripped her arm suggested ownership, not guardianship. The girl's dress was elaborate, finely tailored, yet inappropriate for her age. Her face bore the same lifeless glaze Emma had seen in Mary's, hollow, defeated, broken. As the man ushered Sarah toward a waiting carriage, Emma stepped forward, desperate to call out. Their eyes met for a breathless second. And in that fleeting moment, the girl's eyes screamed the words her lips could not. "Help me." Then the carriage door slammed. The horses stirred. The man barked orders. And they were gone. That night, Emma could no longer silence her conscience. She penned a second letter to St. Catherine's, but this one was different. No pleasantries, no subtle hints. Her words were sharp, direct. She demanded answers. She asked for the names and addresses of the families who had allegedly adopted Mary and Sarah. She requested a visit to the academy, citing her continued concern for the other girls she once knew. She wanted the truth, and she wanted it now. A week later, the reply arrived. But this time, the envelope bore not the familiar pen of Sister Agnes. The response came from Mother, Superior Victoria Whitman herself. It was short, polite, poisoned. With veiled threat, Mother Whitman wrote that Emma's continued inquiries were disrupting the peace and sanctity of those who had moved on to new lives. She suggested that Emma's mind might be clouded by grief, causing her to mistake strangers for old friends. The letter closed with a line so chilling it left Emma frozen. Young women who persist in matters that do not concern them often find their own safety and reputation compromised. I trust a sensible girl like yourself understands the wisdom of letting sleeping dogs lie. It was not advice. It was a warning. Emma, however, was not easily silenced. By now, her instincts had crystallized into certainty. The girls at St. Catherine's weren't being adopted, they were being vanished. Some, it seemed, were reappearing in brothels, dressed and posed like puppets for Boston's elite. Others simply dissolved into thin air. No letters, no sightings, no graves, and no justice. But what could she do? She was a seamstress, a working-class woman with no power, no money, and no one willing to believe such monstrous accusations against women of God. Still, she tried. She approached local churches. They refused to entertain rumors against a Catholic institution they had publicly supported. She wrote letters to newspapers. They never replied. She even visited the police station, but was laughed out of the office. "Sounds like a ghost story," one officer said. "Maybe keep that for bedtime, miss." It would have ended their Emma, screaming into the void if fate hadn't intervened once again. In the summer of 1847, the tides of Boston Harbor coughed up a secret. The body of a young woman was found tangled in seaweed beneath a dock. 18 years old, perhaps younger. Her face bore signs of abuse, her skin pale with death. But what drew immediate attention was the crude tattoo etched into her wrist, a small cross, and beneath it 2 letters SC. Detective William Ashworth had seen many horrors in his years on the force, but this case gnawed at him. The tattoo wasn't professionally done. It looked like the kind of thing scratched into skin in desperation. Esque, what could it mean? He began pulling missing persons files. Girls gone without a trace. Girls placed in homes that never wrote back. And a pattern began to emerge. Most of them were last seen near Salem. Many had once been residents of the same Christian institution. St. Catherine's Academy. It was a lead. A quiet one, but enough to start digging. Ashworth's investigation took him through Boston's dark underbelly back alley brothels, underground clubs, private homes cloaked in pretense. What he uncovered was a sophisticated, well-funded network that specialized in trafficking young girls. These weren't street waifs. They were educated, well-trained, and polished to perfection. A product, not a person. And there. Source? Every trail pointed to one place. St. Catherine's. Ashworth knew this couldn't be approached head-on. The academy was protected. The women in charge were adored by the public, and endorsed by the powerful. So he created a false identity, Cornelius Blackwood, a wealthy merchant with a tragic backstory and a sickly wife in need of a youthful companion. He approached Mother Whitman with his request. She didn't hesitate. She offered him 3 girls ages 14 to 16, described as sweet, well-behaved, obedient. The implication wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't need to be. Discretion was expected. Payment was hefty. When Ashworth met the girls, it was clear they weren't being adopted. They were being offered, dressed in expensive clothing, hairstyled. Makeup applied. These girls had been prepared, groomed. Their innocence was weaponized for profit. But Ashworth wasn't prepared for what he saw next. As he was being led out, he caught sight of another part of the building. A barred workshop. Below ground. Inside were girls exhausted, disheveled, silently working under watchful eyes. They weren't being trained. They were being broken. That night, Ashworth reached out to Emma Prescott. He had received one of her early letters, tucked in an anonymous envelope in a department file. At first, it had seemed too wild to be true. Now it was a roadmap. They met in secret. Emma brought every detail she remembered, names, timelines, even old drawings from her days at the academy. Ashworth, in turn, shared what he had seen behind the veil of false charity. Together, they knew this could no longer remain in the shadows. They would need more. Evidence, testimonies, leverage. But more than anything, they would need courage, because what they were up against wasn't just a single school. It was a machine oiled by money and protected by power. And that machine had already claimed dozens of silent victims. Emma Prescott and William Ashworth were determined to be the first. Ones it failed to silence. Autumn arrived with a chill that crept through the stones of Salem like a whisper from the grave. The year was 1847, and the Academy of St. Catherine stood as proudly as ever on Gallows Hill Road. From the outside, it was a fortress of faith and female virtue. But inside, a different truth slithered beneath the polished surface, one that had now caught the attention of a man who refused to be fooled by sacred titles and stained glass smiles. Detective William Ashworth had returned from his undercover visit with a heart full of rage and a notebook thick with coded observations. What he'd seen inside that school was not reform, but rehearsed suffering. Young girls with haunted eyes and artificial grins, dressed not for school, but for show. He'd entered expecting whispers of abuse. He left knowing he had seen a factory for exploitation, but building a case was like threading a needle in a storm.st. Catherine's wasn't some rogue operation in the woods. It had become a respected institution, praised by clergy, endorsed by politicians, and surrounded by a town desperate to believe in its purity. The women running it wore the guise of sainthood, and their illusion was so flawless, most couldn't see the evil peering out from beneath the habit. Ashworth knew he needed more than impressions. He needed something solid, unshakable, evidence that couldn't be swept away or buried under another decade of polite denial. What he found came not from the convent, but from a ledger hidden in plain sight. In the weeks following his visit, Ashworth began connecting dots across jurisdictions. He reviewed disappearance reports from all over Massachusetts, focusing on girls who were supposedly adopted through the academy. Most were orphans. A few had living relatives, but strangely, no contact had ever resumed once the girls were placed. No letters, no returns, no weddings, no deaths. It was as if they'd dissolved into fog. As Ashworth compiled this data, he received a tip from a junior officer in Boston. A physician, Dr. Nathaniel Webb, had a long, unexamined connection to the academy. He had quietly treated dozens of girls associated with the institution, but never spoke of it publicly. His payments were unusually high for a doctor in a town this size Curious Ashworth paid him a visit. Dr. Webb lived in a modest brick home just outside Salem, surrounded by hedges too carefully trimmed. He answered the door with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, I've treated the girls," Webb admitted, pouring tea he didn't drink. "Minor accidents, the occasional flu. Nothing alarming." Ashworth tilted his head. "And yet, I found records of injuries consistent with sexual trauma. Broken bones, infections, abortions." The doctor's hand trembled. He set the cup down. "Detective, you don't understand the position I've been in. I never touched those girls. I only treated them. I was paid not to ask questions. Paid to help them survive, or at least not die too quickly." Ashworth asked for the records. Webb hesitated. Then, sensing which way the wind was turning, agreed under one condition: immunity from prosecution. The documents he handed over were horrifying. Medical reports that read like testimonies of war. Girls no older than 12 suffering injuries that spoke of monstrous acts. Girls with diseases they should never have been exposed to. And most damning, a hidden journal. In it, Dr. Webb had listed the names of the men who had escorted the girls to his office: merchants, judges, pastors. Men respected in every corner of the state. Among them, Judge Harrison Cromwell, Boston's own Mayor Robert Thornton, and Reverend Samuel Blackstone, the very man who once praised the Academy from his pulpit as a beacon of Christian light in dark times. Ashworth had his net, but to pull it tight, he needed one final push witness. That witness arrived on November 15th, 1847. Battered, bleeding, and breathless. It was raining when Sister Margaret Collins stumbled into Ashworth's home like a ghost. Her black habit was torn, smeared with mud and blood. Her hair was matted. Her voice barely escaped her lips. "They know," she whispered. "They know I've been talking to someone. They're going to kill me like they did the others." Ashworth secured the doors and sat her down. She didn't ask for safety. She didn't even ask for forgiveness. She simply spoke as if the weight of silence had finally become too much to bear. "My name isn't Margaret Collins," she confessed. "It's Martha Caldwell. None of us were nuns. We stole those names, those habits, that identity." Ashworth listened in stunned silence as she unraveled the truth. The entire foundation of St. Catherine's was a lie. Martha, Victoria Whitman, and Agnes Murphy had met in prison. Each served time for different crimes: fraud, theft, even murder. When released in 1834, Victoria hatched a plan more daring than any crime they'd attempted before. She had learned that 3 real nuns from Ireland were traveling to Salem to establish a girls' orphanage. Victoria arranged a meeting, but the sisters never made it. Somewhere between Boston and Marblehead, the trio was murdered. Their papers, funds, and identities stolen. "We buried them in a field by the road," Martha whispered. "Then we became them. Sister Victoria, Sister Margaret, Sister Agnes." Salem welcomed the impostors with open arms. At first, the academy was run with some semblance of purpose. They housed a few girls, taught basic skills, but greed soon bloomed in Victoria's heart. When a wealthy man offered an outrageous sum to adopt a girl with no family, Victoria saw an opportunity too profitable to ignore. And from there, the business grew. Quietly, methodically, they didn't just place girls. They prepared them, isolated them, broke them down, rebuilt them into perfect dolls for the powerful and perverse. The basement was not for training in laundry or needlework. It was for obedience, subjugation, grooming. We had names for them. Martha confessed, tears carving tracks through dust. Code names. Clients had preferences: age, hair color, whether the girl should cry or stay silent. Girls who became sick, pregnant, or resistant were disposed of. Victoria called it retirement. A word as cold as the furnace where the bodies were burned. They scattered the ashes in the garden, Martha said. Pretended the girls had been adopted. But I knew. I could smell it. I could hear the screams. Ashworth, hands clenched, asked the question he dreaded. And the 24 girls? Martha nodded. All dead. They were our biggest earners. Our success stories. When they got too old, too damaged. Victoria ended them. All of them. But Martha had one more. Gift to offer. Victoria keeps everything, she said. Records. Client lists. Photos. Letters. It's her trophy room. Hidden in a safe behind her prayer altar. If you want to bring her down, you need what's inside that vault. Ashworth realized then that he was standing on the edge of a revelation larger than anything he'd imagined. This wasn't just a case of abuse. It was an empire, a network, a machine grinding girls into dust, run by monsters in disguise and protected by men in power. The next move would decide everything. Because in the morning they would strike. The rain hadn't stopped for hours. As dawn crept up on November 16, 1847. A cold gray mist settled over Salem, veiling the streets like a shroud. Within that fog, shadows moved with purpose. They didn't wear uniforms from the local precinct. These men had been summoned quietly, Massachusetts state police officers and federal marshals, chosen carefully by Detective William Ashworth himself. Not one had ties to the Boston elite. Not one could be bought, because today they were marching against a fortress of deception. St. Catherine's Academy. Ashworth stood at the head of the convoy, his jaw tight, his coat soaked. Inside his pocket was a signed warrant. Inside his briefcase, Martha Caldwell's full confession, Dr. Webb's ledgers, and the list of over 100 girls believed to have passed through the Academy's gates and never come out. Time had run out. He glanced toward Martha, who stood beside him in a borrowed coat, her habit discarded. Her face was pale but resolute. She knew what was waiting inside. So did he. The Academy loomed ahead, its brick walls rising through the morning mist like a monument to false virtue. At exactly 6 a.m., the front doors were shattered open. The entry hall, usually serene and orderly, exploded into chaos. Girls in nightgowns huddled in the corridors, terrified. Servants froze mid-step. But it wasn't the students or the staff the officers were there for. They had come for the architects of a nightmare, Mother Superior. Victoria Whitman was caught mid-escape just past the garden wall, dragging a suitcase heavy with gold coins, forged documents, and jewelry payments from clients. Her face, usually composed and pious, twisted into fury as she was wrestled to the ground and cuffed in the mud. In the basement, Agnes Murphy was found amidst smoke and embers, attempting to burn documents in the Academy's hidden crematorium. Her eyes met Ashworth's as she was dragged away, burning with hatred, as though she had been betrayed by a system she once thought she owned. And the third accomplice, Father Patrick Alley, if that was even his name, was gone, vanished like a ghost, no trace, no farewell. Just a hollow chapel and a Bible with a false bottom. The search team swept through the building with clinical precision. On the surface, it was exactly what the Academy had always claimed to be: dormitories with neat beds, classrooms with chalk-dusted blackboards, prayer rooms filled with light. But once you crossed the threshold into the off-limits sections, the basement, the locked third floor, a narrow corridor behind the altar, the truth oozed from the walls. They uncovered a hidden dormitory with luxury furnishings and strange paraphernalia. Makeup kits, heels, costumes. Everything used to disguise children as something older, something they were never meant to become. These were the rooms for special training. Down in the basement, the real horror waited. Behind a false wall, officers found the remnants of a furnace iron bones of a system designed to erase human evidence. Inside the ashes were fragments of teeth and bone, charred cloth, bits of rosary chains melted into slag. More than 30 skull fragments were recovered, all female, all underage. Nearby, they found what would become the case's most damning artifact, a ledger dot. It was meticulous, handwritten, chronicling every transaction, every client, every girl, processed through St. Catherine's over 13 years. Each girl was listed by name, age, attributes, and the payment amount. The pages were marked with cold terminology: placed, returned, retired, destroyed dot, and next to each notation initials. The initials of the men who had purchased innocence and paid for silence. 3 signatures stood out: Victoria Whitman, Agnes Murphy, Martha Caldwell, but there was a 4th. Ashworth's eyes narrowed when he saw ITP Ali, the man who called himself a priest who had blessed the Academy's halls with false prayers and used his collar as a shield. He had been there from the beginning, a phantom investor in human misery, and he was gone. The aftermath of the raid sent tremors through Massachusetts. The news spread like wildfire. Journalists from Boston and New York descended upon Salem. Headlines screamed of the saints of sign, hell in a habit, and the nuns who sold children. The public was both horrified and disbelieving. How could 3 women of faith, guardians of orphans, be behind such depravity? The answer lay in the faces of the survivors. Many of the rescued girls, though safe now, remained silent, traumatized beyond language. Others told whispered stories of rooms that never saw sunlight, of days spent walking perfectly and smiling on command, of punishments delivered in prayer. The most haunting confession came from a girl named Hannah Clark, age 16. "They told me my parents were dead," she said. "They told me if I ever left, no one would believe me. They said God had chosen me for this." She didn't cry. She didn't blink. She just spoke the truth. Victoria Whitman was held without bail. In her first court appearance, she wore a black veil and smiled at reporters. When asked by a journalist if she had anything to say, she simply replied, "The Lord tests his most faithful." Agnes Murphy was less composed. She lashed out at her captors, screaming about betrayal, about gutter girls lying, about how they were the ones saving those children from the streets. But it was the documents, not the confessions, that sealed their fates. The Academy's safe revealed photographs girls, posed like painted dolls, eyes dead behind curled hair and forced smiles. Letters from clients thanking the institution for their discretion and high-quality companions. Ledgers with handwritten notes on profits, sicknesses, deaths. There was no more hiding. Ashworth sat with Emma Prescott days after the raid, the 2 of them staring into a fire that crackled without warmth. She had been the first to speak, the first to ask, the first to be warned to stay quiet. Now, her words were being quoted in newspapers. Her observations became part of history. "You did it," Ashworth said softly. Emma shook her head. "We did it. But at what cost? How many were buried before someone listened?" Ashworth didn't answer. He didn't need to. The world had changed, but not fast enough. Burials were arranged for the remains found in the basement. Public donations funded a memorial at Green Lawn Cemetery in Salem. 24 names carved in stone. Names of girls who had never left the Academy alive. Girls erased from life, but now remembered in death. Ashworth stood at the memorial's unveiling, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't cry. He simply stood guard, like a soldier at a tomb. And somewhere in the crowd, Emma whispered, "They're not forgotten anymore." But the investigation wasn't over. The ledger revealed far more than one Academy's crimes. It hinted at a network, a trade, a circle of influence that stretched beyond Salem's borders. And the 4th signature, P, Ali, remained a phantom. Victoria had built something larger than herself, and the true storm was just beginning. The ink in the ledger had dried years ago, but the moment Ashworth opened that worn, leather-bound book, it was as if the voices of the dead came screaming off the page. Each entry was methodical rows of dates, names, and symbols. Girls catalogued, like livestock, descriptions of height, weight, eye color, notes on behavioral progress. Next to some entries, dollar amounts. Next to others, crosses. A chilling euphemism for those who had been retired. But it was the names beside the transactions that turned Ashworth's stomach. Not the victims, but the clients dotted first. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. These weren't nameless. Men from seedy taverns or dark alleys. These were men with legacies, portraits in town halls, statues in city squares. Judge Harrison Cromwell, Mayor Robert Thornton, Senator Elias Kendrick, Father Samuel Blackstone, pillars of New England society. Some had been praised for their philanthropy. Others had spoken publicly about moral decay and the sanctity of the family. Yet here they were, listed in looping script, paying for children as if selecting cigars from a shelf dot next to some of their names were coded notes. Prefers docile. No resistance. Paid extra for silence. Ashworth felt bile rise. In his throat, he realized then this wasn't just a rogue orphanage. It was a supply chain, and St. Catherine's had merely been one of its most efficient factories. Back at Boston headquarters, Ashworth brought the ledger to his commanding officer, Captain Brennan. The captain sat behind his oak desk, fingers steepled, eyes unreadable. As Ashworth laid out the evidence, "I need protection for these documents," Ashworth said. "And I need clearance to begin arresting the clients listed." But Brennan didn't move. He stared at the pages, then slowly closed the book. "These are powerful men, Ashworth." "They're monsters," Ashworth replied. "I don't care if they built churches or funded hospitals. They bought children. They killed them when they became inconvenient." Brennan sighed. "And what happens when we put them on trial? When they deny everything, hire the best attorneys, bury us in counterclaims? What happens when their friends in Washington pull strings you and I can't even see?" "Then we make it public," Ashworth said. "We take this to the press." Brennan looked up sharply. "You'd risk destroying everything? The department's credibility? Your own career?" "I'd risk all of it," Ashworth said, "if it means one of those girls gets justice." There was a long pause. Finally, Brennan stood and walked to the window. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said, his voice low. "Because once this breaks, they'll come for you." They came faster than expected. That evening, Ashworth returned home to find his apartment door cracked open. Inside, drawers were overturned, files missing, furniture slashed. But nothing was stolen, only his notes, sketches of the academy layout, copies of the ledger, and on his desk, a message scratched into the wood with a knife. "You're next." Meanwhile, Martha Caldwell, formerly Sister Margaret, had been placed under protective custody. She'd become a key witness, supplying names, locations, even routes used to transport girls between cities. She spoke of houses in Connecticut, safe houses in New York, and a brothel in Providence disguised as a convent. But it was one name that stood out among all her revelations: Father Patrick Alley. He was never a priest, she explained. Victoria found him in prison. He'd run scams posing as clergy. When we needed legitimacy, she brought him in. He played the role better than any of us. Ashworth was stunned. Ali had performed baptisms, held masses, comforted grieving parents. All performance. But where is he now? Ashworth asked. Martha shook her head. If he's not dead, he's in hiding. He knew this would crumble eventually. Ashworth suspected otherwise. Men like Ali didn't vanish. They rebranded. He turned his attention to the remaining names. In the ledger cross-referencing addresses, business records, court cases. He began assembling a target list. 52 men across 5 states, some still active in politics, others hiding behind religious titles. Many had already caught wind of the scandal. Then came the first death. Judge Harrison Cromwell was found slumped over in his study, a pistol in his hand, a single bullet through his temple. The coroner ruled it a suicide, but Ashworth noted something. Odd, no powder burns, no blood on the weapon grip, and a half-finished glass of wine, untouched. 2 days later, Reverend Blackstone was discovered drowned in his own baptismal font. The church claimed he slipped. Ashworth didn't believe in that kind of divine irony. One by one, names from the ledger began dying under suspicious circumstances. The message was clear. Someone was cleaning house. Emma Prescott, now under surveillance. For her safety, received an anonymous envelope one morning. Inside was a single page from the ledger one with her friend Mary O'Brien's name on it. Next to it, retired 1837. Attempted escape. Payment refunded. There was no signature. Just a pressed flower, dried and brittle. Emma broke down. It was confirmation she hadn't asked for, but needed to see. Mary hadn't been adopted. She'd been murdered. That night, she wrote a letter to the Boston Globe under a pseudonym detailing everything she had seen, heard, and survived. Within a week, it made front-page headlines. The Girls of Gallows Hill, a survivor speaks. The true story behind St. Catherine's Academy, the public reaction was explosive. Crowds gathered outside the former academy grounds. A memorial of dolls and ribbons formed at the gates. People who had once praised the nuns now burned there, pamphlets in fury. But not everyone was supportive. Emma began receiving threats. Anonymous letters, rocks thrown through her window. She was called a liar, a disgrace, a troublemaking woman with delusions. Some blamed her for disturbing the peace, for dragging the good names of Boston's elite through the mud. But she refused to back down. "I was silent once," she told a reporter. "I won't be again." Ashworth pressed on with the case, building momentum, pushing for federal intervention. But every step forward came with resistance. Files went missing. Witnesses recanted. Judges mysteriously recused themselves. Even Dr. Webb, whose testimony was critical, suffered a sudden heart attack just days before he was to appear in court. He died clutching a bottle of pills, his journal missing from his home. Ashworth knew then they were running out of time. The conspiracy had roots deeper than anyone imagined. It wasn't just Salem. It wasn't just one academy. There were others. Dozens, maybe more. Hidden behind charity fronts and religious orders. An entire underground world built on silence. And now that world was collapsing. But as Ashworth prepared for the trials to come, he knew the next phase would be the most dangerous. Yet, because the final chapter wasn't about exposing the guilty, it was about surviving long enough to bring them down. The memorial at Green Lawn Cemetery stood quiet under a gray February sky. 24 names carved in stone, lined in solemn rows. Flowers rested at their base, some fresh, others wilted, but the wind carried only silence. Detective Ashworth visited the site often, not out of ritual, but responsibility. These names weren't just memories. They were warnings, and they weren't alone. The ledger had told him that there were more. Many more as the storm surrounding St. Catherine's began to fade from the headlines. Ashworth found himself drawn deeper into its shadow. The conspiracy had been larger than the public wanted to believe. People liked closure. They wanted to think the evil had been buried with Victoria Whitman's trial. But Ashworth knew better. Catherine's hadn't been an isolated horror. It had been a model. A month after the raid, a packet arrived at Ashworth's office unmarked, unreturnable. Inside were photographs, a hand-drawn map, and a note in a shaky hand. Hartford, New Haven, Providence, same system. Different names. They trade girls like horses. There were no signatures. Only a symbol at the bottom, a crude rendering of a cross wrapped in a chain. Ashworth leaned back in his chair, heart-pounding. If what this note implied was true, the Academy was merely the tip of a monstrous iceberg. He shared the contents with Emma Prescott, who now lived under federal protection. Her face went pale as she scanned the photographs. "I've seen her before," Emma whispered, pointing to one of the girls in a classroom photo. "She was at St. Catherine's, but they said she ran away. Her name wasn't in the memorial. She was one of the missing." Ashworth began mapping connections. He compiled orphanage records from nearby states, tracking names from the original ledger and comparing them with missing persons reports. What he found was chilling. Identical patterns. Girls admitted. Profiles rewritten. Paperwork forged. And then nothing. No correspondence. No public records. No deaths. Just silence. One such institution was the Sisters of Divine Shelter in Providence. On paper, it served as a recovery home for destitute young women. In reality, Ashworth suspected it was a sister operation to St. Catherine's. Same recruitment tactics, same religious front, same clients. He approached federal agents in Rhode Island. But resistance came swiftly. "We've had no complaints," one official said. "No survivors either." Ashworth countered, but access was denied. That's when Martha Caldwell made a stunning revelation. During a late-night interview, she leaned forward and said, "We weren't alone." Victoria was in contact with 2 women in Connecticut. They called their place Our Lady of Restoration. They were even more brutal than we were. Ashworth raised an eyebrow. "Names?" "I never learned." "They're real ones," Martha said. But Victoria called them the Daughters of Rachel. They used the same language, same system. When we had girls who didn't suit certain clients, we sent them there. Ashworth scribbled furiously. "Did you ever send any of the original?" 24? Martha hesitated. "Yes, 2. So even the sacred list wasn't complete." Ashworth now had a new mission: expose the entire web. He presented his findings to the Massachusetts Attorney General, urging a multi-state task force. The evidence was staggering: forged adoptions, falsified death certificates, and a pattern of abuse stretching across at least 5 states. But the reaction wasn't what he expected. "Detective," the Attorney General said with a sigh, "you've already made headlines with one scandal. Digging deeper could destabilize charitable institutions everywhere." Ashworth stared at him in disbelief. "They're murdering children." "And if we go public with every unconfirmed connection," the man replied, "we'll create mass panic. Churches will burn. Innocent staff will be attacked. We need time, proof, cooperation from other states." Ashworth understood the coded language. Delay, distract, discredit. The system was cracking, but not ready to let itself fall. So he changed tactics. He went underground. Ashworth and a small team of trusted agents began investigating the satellite institutions discreetly. They posed as potential donors, visiting homes in Connecticut and Rhode Island. Some were clean, genuinely charitable. Others radiated the same eerie orderliness he remembered from St. Catherine's. One home in New Haven stood out. St. Eliza's House for Girls. It had the same tall windows, the same locked 3rd floor, the same strange absence of alumni records, and the same guarded welcome. Inside, the girls smiled too widely. They spoke too politely. Their eyes darted toward corners as if waiting for invisible cues. Ashworth left. Shaken, the house mother there, Sister Clarissa, reminded him far too much of Victoria. Later, through a contact in city records, he discovered that St. Eliza's was registered under a shell company tied to an educational cooperative. in Albany run by one of the same men listed in the St. Catherine's ledger. The pattern was undeniable. Meanwhile, public interest was shifting. The press had grown weary of the story. Readers moved on. Politicians distanced themselves. And with every new raid or revelation Ashworth pursued, the backlash grew. These are isolated incidents, pundits claimed. We can't punish entire institutions for the crimes of a few. And in whispers, why is he still digging? Shouldn't this be over by now? Ashworth knew what was happening. Public fatigue, moral exhaustion. The story had lost its shock value. But evil doesn't disappear just because people stop looking. One night, a package arrived at Ashworth's office. Inside was a Bible with several pages torn out. Folded into its spine was a letter. You've done enough. Keep going and you'll be next in that garden. It wasn't the first threat, but this one chilled him. Because attached was a photograph of his younger sister, taken from across the street. That night, Ashworth relocated her. And for the first time since the case began, he considered walking away. But he couldn't. Because beneath that garden, beneath those crosses, beneath every forgotten orphanage, were names. Names without graves. Names without memorials. Names that still whispered from the margins of history. We are still here. It was Emma who gave him the strength to continue. You're the only one still listening, she said. You think I'm safe? They just haven't decided I matter enough to erase. But if you stop now, every girl they buried becomes invisible again. Ashworth nodded. He wouldn't let that happen. In March of 1848, he stood before a private federal committee and laid everything out: maps, documents, photographs, testimonies, letters. And finally, one name that had surfaced through an informant: Patrick Alling, the man who had called himself Father Ali. He hadn't vanished. He'd changed names again, now operating under a new identity in Philadelphia, claiming to run a shelter for wayward youth. Ashworth requested permission to travel and investigate. The committee hesitated, but finally they approved it. The hunt wasn't over. It had just expanded. The train from Boston to Philadelphia screeched into the station under a slate-gray sky. As Detective Ashworth stepped off, his boots crunching over frost-covered gravel, he clutched a worn satchel full of names, files, and fading hope. This wasn't just another city. This was the trail's final pulse, where the ghosts from St. Catherine's whispered behind unfamiliar walls. Philadelphia had always been proud of its order. Its churches gleamed. Its streets bustled with reformers and businessmen. But Ashworth knew better than to trust what shone in daylight. Evil doesn't advertise. It embeds itself in institutions, cloaks itself in virtue. And if his sources were right, one man had perfected that cloak. Patrick Alling, known in Boston's ledgers as Father Ali. He had re-emerged here under yet another identity. Reverend Peter Allard, head of the House of Mercy for Destitute Girls. The name alone felt like déjà vu. Ashworth didn't approach directly. Not at first. He spent 2 days observing the building, a sprawling, ivy-covered structure on the outskirts of the city, nestled between a silent graveyard and a coal factory. It had once been a boarding school. Now it served as a so-called refuge for fallen girls. The locals spoke of it kindly, said the Reverend did God's work, took in runaways, educated them, protected them. But Ashworth had heard this chorus before, and he'd seen what hid behind the hymns. The girls he watched coming and going wore the same expressions he remembered from St. Catherine's: well-behaved, well-groomed, and strangely silent. They walked in perfect lines, eyes to the ground, smiles that never touched their eyes. There were no visitors, no adoptions, no mail sent or received, just a closed system, exactly like before, using a false identity a traveling donor representing a Catholic endowment Ashworth requested a meeting. With Reverend Allard Dott, it was granted. The man who greeted him in the grand parlor wore a collar and a tailored black coat. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hands soft. But Ashworth saw past the disguise instantly. The eyes were the same, calculating, serpentine. "Welcome to the House of Mercy," the Reverend said, extending his hand. "God bless your interest in our mission." Ashworth returned the gesture. "And God bless yours. I've heard remarkable things." "Humility forbids me to accept such praise," Allard replied, his smile practiced. "But we do what we can. The world has little use for damaged girls. We restore them." Ashworth forced a nod. "And where do they go afterward?" The smile didn't flicker. "Some stay. Others are placed in homes with benefactors who understand their needs." Ashworth's blood ran cold. The phrasing was deliberate. "A signal," he pressed on. "I've heard your girls are adaptable. Are there particular traits your patrons look for?" Allard's gaze narrowed. "You're not here to donate, are you?" "No," Ashworth said calmly, reaching into his coat. "I'm here to expose you?" The arrest wasn't cleaned out by the time Ashworth's backup arrived Philadelphia detectives. And Federal Marshals Allard had already begun destroying records. Fires burned in his office fireplace. Girls were hidden in locked rooms behind false walls. One officer broke through plaster to reveal 3 girls huddled and chained. They wept when the door opened not with fear, but with disbelief. One of them clutched a note pinned to her dress. "Unfit for placement." The phrase sent Ashworth spiraling. He'd read it before Dot in St. Catherine's Ledger. This place wasn't just similar. It was connected. The raid revealed a mirror image of everything Ashworth had fought in Massachusetts. Secret dorms, training, schedules disguised as devotional lessons, records of girls marked by code, ready, gifted, difficult, and worst of all, erased. Inside a hidden safe, investigators found some matching girls still listed as missing in Connecticut and Rhode Island. Correspondence revealed payment instructions routed through New York City. It wasn't just one man. It was a network. But the most damning find came in the form of a single black ledger, tucked between psalms in a chapel pulpit. It bore a title, Ra, 1834 to 1848. Inside, transactions, initials, cross-referenced entries from St. Catherine's. The chain was complete. Reverend Peter Allard Patrick Alling had helped launch the original operation. And for over a decade, he'd expanded it, feeding girls into a hidden ring that spanned from Boston to Philadelphia. This wasn't a scandal. It was a criminal syndicate. Word of the raid reached Boston within 24 hours. The headlines came back with "A Vengeance. From Salem to Philadelphia. The child market exposed. Unholy orders. A ring of religious abuse spanning states. Girls traded like cattle. Who's really responsible?" Congress demanded answers. Governors scrambled to distance themselves. And suddenly, the same judges who once refused to hear Ashworth's evidence were calling for national reform. It had taken 2 states, 3 raids, and dozens of dead girls. The silence had finally broken. Emma Prescott read the news from a safe house in Baltimore. She wept not out of relief, but vindication. They had called her delusional, hysterical, obsessed. Now, the world knew she was right, but it came at a price. The attacks on her credibility resumed, louder than ever. Public figures accused her of being part of an anti-religious conspiracy. Anonymous letters flooded in. Strangers spat on her in the streets. Still, she stood firm. "Let them hate me," she said in a newspaper interview, "as long as they remember the girls." In early April, Ashworth was summoned to Washington, D.C. to testify before a special congressional committee. His words were blunt, emotionless, factual. There are likely more institutions like these, more Patrick Allings, more girls living behind, locked doors with no one watching. And unless this country reforms how it oversees orphanages, religious institutions, and child placement programs, it will happen again. The hearing room fell into silence. Then came applause. For the first time since the beginning, Ashworth felt something unfamiliar. Momentum. In Philadelphia, Reverend Allard A.K.K. Patrick Alling was held without bail, but Ashworth wasn't. Celebrating. Because Ailing wasn't talking. He'd refused to cooperate, refused to admit anything, refused even to acknowledge the girls he'd caged. His silence was deafening. But Ashworth suspected that silence hid more names, more connections, perhaps, even people in law enforcement or federal offices, because you don't traffic over 120 girls across state lines for over a decade without someone on the inside. And if Alling ever spoke, the shock waves could demolish institutions. From coast to coast, Ashworth's greatest fear now wasn't losing the case. It was that someone might make sure Alling never got to speak at all. By mid-April 1848, the world had changed. The names of forgotten girls, once hidden in ledger margins and burned in basement furnaces, were now spoken in congressional halls and printed in national newspapers. What began in a decaying academy on Gallows Hill had grown into the largest criminal investigation in New England's history. But Detective William Ashworth knew this wasn't justice yet. It was only exposure. And exposure, in a world ruled by men in power and cloaked in religion, was a fragile thing. Reverend Peter Allard, formerly Patrick Alling, sat in a high-security holding facility outside Philadelphia. He spoke to no one, not the guards, not the lawyers, not the journalists begging for a confession. But that silence didn't stop the machine of accountability from creaking into motion. Ashworth, now acting as lead federal liaison, presented his compiled evidence to a multi-state tribunal. What he laid out wasn't just the history of a single institution. It was a roadmap of rot. Over 130 girls trafficked across state lines, minus 47 coded client names, including politicians, clergy, and businessmen. Forged adoption papers linking 7 orphanages and 3 deaths tied directly to whistleblowers or witnesses. The committee listened in silence, eyes wide, hands gripping notes they never expected to write. When Ashworth concluded with, "This wasn't a lapse in oversight, it was a business," the chamber erupted in gasps. But what came next was even more damning. A woman named Anna Whitley stepped forward. She had once worked as a secretary for a private charity called New Dawn Ministries, based in Albany. After reading about the Philadelphia raid in the papers, she realized the ledger's initials, ND matched stamps she had processed on donation envelopes. Years ago, she came with letters, receipts, routing instructions, and a photograph. It was of a 12-year-old girl standing in front of a fireplace in a silk dress, eyes empty. On the back, a handwritten note, delivered from SCA to Providence, 1844, groomed, ready. The initials at the bottom, P.A. Ashworth didn't need. A translator. New Dawn Ministries was the financial shell behind the entire operation. Donations funneled through churches, converted into adoption grants, then transferred into accounts managed by shell corporations. They hadn't just been trafficking girls. They had been laundering money through the church itself. When this information went public, the backlash was seismic. Dozens of high-ranking officials across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania resigned or were arrested. Some fled the country. A handful, those too old, too rich, or too insulated, simply denied everything and lawyered up. But one man couldn't run. Mayor Robert Thornton of Boston, once a vocal supporter of St. Catherine's, was named directly in Martha Caldwell's testimony and corroborated in Dr. Webb's medical records. His name appeared in 3 different ledgers. And unlike many of the accused, he didn't deny it. He called a press conference. The city held its breath. "I was misled," he said, standing beneath the marble pillars of City Hall. "I donated to what I believed was a Christian institution. I had no knowledge of wrongdoing." But reporters weren't fooled. One bold journalist shouted, "Then why did you pay for silence?" Thornton hesitated, and then walked off stage. His political career ended in under 2 minutes. But Ashworth knew the system wasn't done protecting itself. Witnesses began vanishing. One former staff member from a Providence orphanage was found, drowned in a river. Another, a cook at St. Eliza's in New Haven, was found hanged behind her home. The coroner ruled it a suicide, but neighbors reported seeing 2 unfamiliar men lurking in her alley the night before. Even Ashworth received another warning, a single bullet casing left on his doorstep. He doubled security. He began wearing armor beneath his coat, and he kept going, because something had shifted. People were paying attention. Emma Prescott became a reluctant symbol. Her photo appeared in newspapers. Her story was dramatized in pulp journals. Some called her a hero. Others accused her of orchestrating a conspiracy against the church. One night, a flaming cross was left outside her safe house, but Emma didn't flinch. They tried to erase. "Those girls," she said in a speech to the Women's Reform Assembly in Boston. "They buried their names, their stories, their bones, but they forgot one thing some of us remember." The applause lasted 5 minutes. In June, Ashworth was invited back to testify before Congress. This time, the gallery was full. Journalists scribbled every word. Survivors sat in the balcony, their faces partially veiled, their eyes focused. He didn't use legal jargon. He told the truth. He spoke of Mary O'Brien, the first girl Emma tried to save; of Sarah Thompson, last seen in a stranger's carriage; of the hidden dormitories, the furnaces, the contracts marked retired. Then he said something no one expected. "There are still more places like St. Catherine's. You just haven't found them yet." He stared at the men seated before him. "Because you weren't looking." Later that week, President James K. Polk addressed the nation in a rare public statement. "We are horrified by these revelations. The exploitation of children under the guise of faith is a betrayal of our highest ideals. We will act." And action came swiftly. A federal oversight bill was passed to regulate orphanages, adoption processes, and private charities. For the first time, religious institutions were required to submit to surprise inspections. National Orphan Registry was proposed, and new laws gave trafficking survivors the right to testify anonymously. In the final days of summer, Ashworth returned to the ruins of St. Catherine's Academy. The building had been demolished by locals, reduced to rubble and ash. But the stone arch still stood, the one that once held a wooden sign reading, "A place of grace for God's daughters." Now, graffiti covered the bricks. Ashworth noticed a single phrase written in red chalk: "They are watching now." He smiled grimly. Let them watch, because the reckoning had only just begun. September 1848 arrived with a burning sense of expectation. Across the United States, from the drawing rooms of Boston to the church pews of Philadelphia, every conversation circled one name: Reverend Peter Allard, once a faceless manipulator in the shadows, now the accused architect of America's most horrifying child trafficking ring. His trial was set to begin at the U.S. District Court in Pennsylvania, and the nation was watching. People camped outside the courthouse. Journalists arrived by train in droves. Sketch artists sharpened their pencils. Survivors prepared to face the man who had stolen their childhoods. But one question loomed over it all: would justice truly be served? Detective William Ashworth arrived early on the first day. He wore a dark suit not his usual badge and coat, and sat silently near the front. His case had traveled a long road, from cracked floorboards in Salem to sealed courtrooms in Washington. And this moment was the summit. Next to him sat Emma Prescott. Her eyes were tired, lined with months of stress and memory. But her hands were steady. Together they waited as the doors opened. Allard entered last, shackled at the wrists, dressed in a plain brown suit. His beard had grown thinner, his skin paler, but the cold calculation in his eyes hadn't faded. He looked at Ashworth only once, and smirked. The prosecution's case was a fortress built on paper and pain. First came the ledger's 4 volumes, recovered from St. Catherine's, the Philadelphia Orphanage, and New Dawn Ministries. Each ledger lined with names, payments, codes. Together, they mapped out 14 years of systemic abuse. Then came the medical records from Dr. Nathaniel Webb. He couldn't testify, having died of a heart attack months prior, but his journals were entered into evidence. They told a silent, horrifying story of broken bones, forced pregnancies, and repeated trauma, each injury tied to a specific girl, and each name tied back to Allard. Then the survivors took the stand. One by one, girls now grown stood before the court. Some trembled. Some spoke clearly. Some couldn't look at Allard at all. But each painted the same bleak picture, how they had been taken in, broken down, dressed up, and sold. Their testimonies tore through the courtroom like a thunderstorm. One girl, now 19, said quietly, "They told me Jesus wanted me to obey, that this pain was purification. But it wasn't God in that room, it was him." She pointed at Allard. He didn't flinch. The defense tried to spin it all as fabrication. An anti-Catholic crusade, a hysteria fed by emotional women and agenda-driven journalists. But the paper trail was impossible to ignore. So the defense pivoted. They claimed Allard wasn't the mastermind, that he was merely a pawn in a system much larger than himself. A system, they said, that included dozens of powerful men now too scared to show their faces. Their gambit was clear: deflect responsibility upward, blur guilt until it became fog. But Ashworth had expected this. In a move that stunned the courtroom. He took the stand himself. "I've spent every day of the last year tracing this man's trail," he said. "He wasn't a pawn. He was the architect. He didn't follow orders, he issued them. He wasn't trapped in this system. He built it." He paused, then added, "And if others were involved, I promise you I'm coming for them next." A hush fell across the room. For the first time, Allard's expression changed. His smirk faded. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On the 4th, the courtroom filled before dawn. Reporters whispered. Survivors held hands. And Ashworth stood at the back, arms folded, heart bracing for whatever came next. "All rise," the bailiff said. The jury foreman read the verdict. "On all counts guilty." Gasps, applause, sobs, shock. Allard showed no reaction. He simply sat down, folded his hands, and closed his eyes. He would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, but the damage he had done could never be fully undone. After the verdict, Emma Prescott addressed the crowd outside the courthouse. She stood on the marble steps, her voice clear despite the chaos around her. "This wasn't about me," she said. "It was about every girl who never got to grow up. Every child silenced in a system built on obedience and fear. Today, we told the world that their lives mattered." When asked what came next, she replied, "Now we find the rest of them." And so began the second investigation. Fueled by the trial's momentum, Ashworth launched a multi-state task force. This time, he wasn't working in the shadows. Now he had funding, authority, and public support. They targeted orphanages and institutions flagged in the Philadelphia evidence. Anonymous letters flooded in. Whistleblowers stepped out of hiding. Survivors began writing to each other. Dozens of new facilities were raided. Some were clean. Others WEREN single quotes T. In upstate New York. A chapel basement revealed a row of locked cages. In Charleston, South Carolina, a so-called reform school had been sending recovered girls to the Caribbean. And in Chicago, authorities found a ledger identical in handwriting to St. Catherine's dated 1849. It was still happening, but this time, someone was watching. Meanwhile, a memorial was planned. Ashworth and Emma worked with lawmakers to establish a national day of remembrance for victims of institutional abuse. On the anniversary of the St. Catherine's raid, a monument was unveiled in Salem's town square. The sculpture stood 12 feet tall, cast in iron, and shaped like an open door with 24 names etched around the frame. But beneath them, in smaller lettering, were 3 words: not all found, because even now, many girls remained nameless, buried in unmarked graves or lost to forgotten ledgers. And Ashworth hadn't stopped looking. One evening, as he reviewed a shipment of documents from a Vermont orphanage, Ashworth found something strange in an old, torn journal. The entries were frantic, almost illegible, written by a girl named Catherine Doyle, dated 1838. Her final words: "They told me I would go to a family, but there is no family, only fire." Ashworth felt the weight of it in his chest. So many voices, so many flames, and one final ember refused to die. As autumn settled again over Salem, Ashworth walked alone to the site where St. Catherine's once stood. The garden had returned. Wildflowers bloomed where ashes once fell, and the wind whispered through the trees like voices that still waited. He knelt, touched the earth, and whispered, "I remember you." Then he stood, coat billowing, and walked back toward town, toward the next case, the next girl, the next shadow still clinging to the edge of history. Because the war was not over. Not yet. 1 year had passed since the trial. The world had moved on in the way it always does. Headlines faded. Politicians found new causes. Church bells rang again. The towns that had once whispered with horror slowly returned to their rituals sweeping. The streets, lighting candles, pretending the dark had finally left. But not for William Ashworth. The silence hadn't ended for him. It had only grown quieter. More cunning. There were still names missing from the ledger. Still girls unaccounted. Still institutions that denied any knowledge of the truth, even as hidden rooms. Forged records and shattered lives continued to surface across the country. And in the middle of it all sat one file, unlabeled, untouched, untraceable. A single page, brittle with time. No letterhead, no stamps. Just a list of girls' names he didn't recognize written in shaky handwriting, signed with 2 initials. E.H. The paper had been discovered inside an old Bible donated anonymously to a Boston church in the spring of 1849. It had been tucked between pages of Exodus. At the bottom of the list was a name that froze Ashworth in place. Elizabeth Hartwell. Ashworth had heard that name once before from Emma. She was a teacher. Emma had said months ago, one of the first to question things. They said she vanished. But I don't think she left. I think she found something. Now, here was her name again. Not as a signature, but as a victim. He reopened the cold case. St. Catherine's records. Listed Elizabeth Hartwell as a literature instructor from 1850. But the building's construction had only begun in 1834. And her disappearance was recorded in 1851, meaning she had survived nearly 2 decades inside the academy before vanishing without a trace. Ashworth returned to Salem and searched for anything birth records, family names, letters. He found nothing. No relatives, no grave, No forwarding address. As if she'd been erased. Then came a letter. It was postmarked from Illinois. No return name. Inside was a single photograph and a note. She tried to warn you all. She wrote it down, but no one read it. A photograph showed a young woman standing in a stone basement, surrounded by small iron-framed beds. Ashworth recognized it instantly. It was the hidden dormitory in the sub-basement of St. Catherine's. First secret room ever discovered. And the woman in the photo? Elizabeth Hartwell. She had found the chamber. She had documented it. She had tried to tell the truth. Before vanishing forever. Haunted by the image, Ashworth traveled to Illinois, following the postmark to a small town outside Chicago. There, buried in the local historical society's archives, he discovered a letter dated March 1851, addressed to the State Committee on Institutional Oversight, Boston, Massachusetts. It was never delivered. The ink had faded, but the words burned. What I found beneath the floorboards must be investigated. These children, they scream without mouths. I do not believe they are ghosts. I believe they are girls who never left. E. H. Ashworth. Returned to Salem immediately. With Emma Prescott at his side, they traced Elizabeth's last known footsteps back to the ruins of St. Catherine's. The garden had grown lush, hiding the scars of its past. Only the stone arch remained. Beneath it, a cracked foundation slab bore a faint symbol, a chained cross, just like the one from the Philadelphia warning. Emma knelt beside it. There's something underneath, she whispered. Ashworth summoned. The excavation team the next day. What they uncovered stunned them all. Beneath the garden was a sealed stone chamber, untouched for over 50 years. It had been carefully hidden, reinforced with concrete and steel, as if someone had gone to great lengths to keep it buried. Inside, they found the remains of 9 girls, perfectly preserved in the dry cold, each still wearing a small silver crucifix, each posed with a ribbon or a doll, but one figure didn't match the others. An adult woman, clutched in her arms, was a leather-bound notebook. Ashworth opened it. First page read, Journal of Elizabeth Hartwell, March 1851. The journal told everything. Elizabeth had discovered the hidden chamber while searching for teaching supplies. She had kept quiet, hoping to gather proof before going to authorities. Over the next several months, she documented what she saw. Secret punishments, forbidden rooms, whispered names of clients. She had planned to escape and deliver her report in person, but she never got the chance. Her final entry read, I hear footsteps above. They found the key I took. If I don't leave tonight, I won't leave at all. But I've hidden this. Journal beneath the nursery floor. If anyone finds this, please tell the world what happened here. Tell them I tried. She never made it out. She had been sealed inside the chamber, buried with the very children she tried to protect. Her journal became the final piece of the puzzle. With it, prosecutors reopened dozens of closed investigations. Emma Prescott oversaw the formation of the Elizabeth Hartwell Foundation, dedicated to exposing institutional abuse in orphanages, schools, and religious institutions nationwide. For the first time, Elizabeth was no longer a forgotten name. She was a martyr, a heroine, a voice that had screamed through time and finally been heard. On a rainy evening in October, Ashworth stood once more in Salem, beside a newly installed statue in the town square. Elizabeth stood in stone, one arm holding a child, other holding an open book. At her feet, etched into the base, she tried. And now we listen. Emma joined him, umbrella in hand. She should have been a teacher, Emma whispered. She shouldn't have died for this. Ashworth nodded. Neither should any of them. For a moment, they said nothing. Then Emma turned to him. Do you think it's over? Ashworth shook his head. No, he said. But it's no longer hidden. and that means they can't win quietly anymore. A month later, another letter arrived on Ashworth's desk. This one unsigned. Inside, a photograph of another institution. A different state. A different name. But beneath it, a familiar phrase. We are still here. Ashworth folded the photo, placed it in his case file, and stood up. The fight wasn't over. But it had changed. Because now, the shadows had nowhere left to hide.